What up, guys? Joachim here, Justin Morgan, and in this video I want to begin a series of videos on why I believe and why I see many Catholics and Protestants becoming Orthodox. My church several years ago became very full with Protestant Christians coming from evangelical backgrounds, coming from other high church backgrounds like Lutheran, Methodist, and Anglicans that flooded into the Orthodox Church. But over the past couple years, we've seen quite a number of Catholics leave the Catholic Church in order to become Orthodox as well. And I want to discuss some of the reasons why I believe this is the case. So this first video that I'm doing in this series will discuss historical continuity and apostolic tradition, and the points that I will be making relate to apostolic succession and historical continuity. And within that section, I want to discuss why the Orthodox Church rejects any notion that the Vatican I understanding of papal infallibility existed in the first millennia or was remotely part of the ancient church. We do not believe this. We do not accept this. We do not believe the church has ever taught any such thing. The second will be the role of ecumenical councils versus papal supremacy. Number 3 will be papal infallibility as a novelty. So you can see there's some overlap on some of these topics. Number 4 will be the Orthodox model of primacy without supremacy. Number 5 will be Catholic counter-arguments and how Orthodox Christians and the Orthodox Church has responded to these. And that will be the end for this first video discussing historical continuity and apostolic tradition. So, apostolic succession and historical continuity. The Orthodox Church claims direct, unbroken apostolic succession from the original 12 apostles, similar to Catholics. However, we argue that fidelity to apostolic tradition is not just about lineage, but also about preserving the teachings and practices of the apostles without alteration. Famously, Pope Pius IX said, "I am the tradition," during the First Vatican Council in 1870. He rejected the idea that bishops were witnesses to tradition. He himself believed only he, as the Pope, was a witness to tradition, and that that bishops were essentially something below that they had no say in that. In essence, he made himself the only bishop. This is obviously a major issue with the idea of bishops to begin with, and it's definitely not something that you see in the first millennia. So this is an innovation. This is something that developed over time. This is not something that was part of the ancient church, at least this Vatican I understanding of the Pope. So obviously, we as Orthodox Christians acknowledge many popes in the first millennia as saints in our church. We speak of them, particularly popes like Pope Gregory the Great. But the Vatican I understanding of what the Pope is significantly altered the idea of the Pope. So sometimes I will actually hear Catholics on YouTube in particular make cases, and they will point to popes in the first millennia, and they will superimpose the modern 19th, 20th century understanding from Vatican I and Vatican II. They will superimpose that back into, or read it back into, a time when it did not exist, and this is problematic. If you are somebody who cares about the truth, who cares about the true faith, then this should be very significant to you, and it should send up red flags when you see it, because that is not honesty, and that is not accepting true faith and true doctrine. So we as Orthodox Christians, we still function in the same conciliar manner as the early church, relying on bishops gathered in councils rather than a centralized papal authority. So that papal authority is not part of what we would call that ancient church. That is not part of the ecumenical councils. Or we as Orthodox Christians emphasize the liturgical and theological traditions which remain largely unchanged since ancient times, whereas Catholicism has introduced new dogma dogmas over time in how they do the liturgy and how they do the Eucharist. So we don't really have any problem exactly with like the traditional Latin Mass, except for some innovations that we feel that exist within it or that came from it. I already mentioned once Pope Gregory the Great in this video, but the Tridentine Mass largely comes from the liturgy of St. Gregory the Great. We have no issues with that. However, there are some additions to it, and it has largely been forsaken by the Catholic Church today. The Catholic Church, the normative Mass that you will see is the Norvis Ordo Mass. In fact, I think the traditional Latin Mass has nearly been extinguished. There's one church in my city, which is a city of around 150,000 people. There's one Catholic church that still offers this Mass, and outside of that, it has been entirely restricted. So, and this comes from a motu proprio sent out by Pope Francis about 4 years ago. Since that time, it has become more and more constricted on who was allowed to do even any part of it. We as Orthodox Christians would not support the idea of doing the liturgy in a foreign language or like doing it in Latin, but the liturgy itself is fine. So we as Orthodox Christians within the Orthodox Church will often do a liturgy, like the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is the single most done liturgy within the Orthodox Church. But we have no issues with doing it in different languages. So my church does that liturgy completely in English, even though it was originally written in Greek. The Catholic Church took a different mode on this. For many centuries, they only did the liturgies, their liturgy in Latin. And then finally, when they came up with they accepted doing the liturgy in the vernacular, they actually made major liturgical changes once they did. So initially, I think they did something similar where they took the traditional Latin Mass and translated it into the vernacular of wherever it was done. But then within about 2 or 3 years after that, they actually came out with new liturgies. So today, the Norvis Ordo, or New Order Mass, is what is the common Mass done. So that's, part of that point. But we do not see where any ecumenical council prior to 1054 affirmed anything similar to papal infallibility. The first 7 ecumenical councils between 325 and 787 AD were the highest doctrinal authorities in the early church, and none of them declared the Pope to be infallible in matters of faith and morals. These councils treated the Pope as an important figure, but not as the ultimate and unquestionable authority. Instead, they relied on conciliar decision-making. If papal infallibility had been an accepted doctrine, one would expect to see it explicitly affirmed in one of these councils, but no such statement exists. There is no statement or witness from an ecumenical council acknowledging a pope to be infallible in the single most important ecumenical doctrinal decision-making areas within the ancient church. It's completely silent on anything remotely like that. So Catholics that are arguing this from these like hidden texts and rare things that they find somewhere across the internet are out of their mind. They're crazy. There's really no way. Even the Vatican doesn't go along this line of argument, but I will see videos from Catholics like Protestants and Orthodox are heretics and they're wrong on papal infallibility, and they'll come up with this like obscure quote from some church father that most of us have never heard of, and it doesn't even directly say usually what it is that they're trying to claim, but the comments will be filled with sections like "nailed it, you got them now." It's kind of wild, but. So key evidence from the actual ecumenical councils, like the ones, like the major ones that everyone knows. The Council of Nicaea in 325 was one of the first ecumenical council, did not turn the Pope for the final word. It did not turn to the Pope on the final word on Arianism, but instead relied on the Council of Bishops. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 defined Christology it famously said, Peter has spoken through Leo, in reference to Pope Leo I, Tome of Leo, but this was accepted only after debate and confirmation by the council, not because Leo was inherently infallible. The Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople, 553, and Third Council of Constantinople in 680 condemned Pope Vigilius and Pope Honorius I for doctrinal errors, which contradicts the idea that popes are infallible. So, counter to Catholic objections, Catholics argue that popes had influence in these councils, and while this is true, the councils did not recognize them as infallible. If papal infallibility were an apostolic teaching, we would expect to see an ecumenical council explicitly affirm this, and yet we do not. So, continuing on this aspect of popes, popes in general have been condemned for heresy. If popes were always divinely protected from teaching error on faith and morals, then no pope would ever have been found guilty of heresy. However, history shows otherwise, and a few key examples include Pope Honorius, Pope Liberius, and Pope Vigilius. So Pope Honorius was condemned as a heretic by the Sixth Ecumenical Council for supporting monothelitism, the heretical belief that Christ had only one will. Later popes reaffirmed this condemnation, including Pope Leo II, Pope Hadrian II, and Pope John VIII. The question for Catholics, then, is how can an infallible pope be condemned for heresy by an ecumenical council and later popes? Pope Liberius in the 4th century allegedly assigned a semi-Arian formula under pressure, contradicting the Nicene faith. The Church Fathers, like St. Athanasius and St. Hilary of Poitiers, criticized him. While some Catholic apologists argue he was acting under duress, the fact remains that he publicly signed a doctrinally problematic statement which an infallible pope should not do. Pope Vigilius in the 6th century changed the position on the 3 chapters controversy multiple times, demonstrating doctrinal inconsistency. If a pope can be declared a heretic by an ecumenical council, then he cannot have been considered infallible at the time. The Catholic Church today claims that popes are only infallible when making ex cathedra statements. However, Vatican I in 1870 did not limit infallibility to explicit proclamations. Rather, it assumed a general divine protection over papal teaching. These historical cases challenge that claim. And that idea of ex cathedra, Catholics will point back to that again and again and again and again. They'll discuss whether the Pope is in the seat or not. But regardless of what some dude on YouTube claims, the original Vatican I, if you read the documents, if you read Vatican I itself, it does not limit that. It does not limit the infallibility to explicit proclamations. It assumes a general divine protection over papal teaching. So the real problem that many Catholics have is not with Orthodox Christianity, it's actually with their own teachings. They hate this idea. They hate that Vatican I made the proclamations that it does because it is an obvious blunder. It's an obvious area of falsehood within their church. Early church fathers did not teach papal infallibility. The church fathers often respected the Bishop of Rome, but their writings do not indicate that he was considered an infallible teacher of doctrine. St. Cyprian of Carthage in the 3rd century rejected the idea that Rome had ultimate authority over other bishops, stating, no one of us sets himself up as a bishop of bishops. And this is in letter 54 to Pope Stephen I. St. Cyprian openly opposed Pope Stephen I's decision on the rebaptism of heretics, showing that the Pope's ruling was not seen as infallible. St. Augustine, in the 4th to 5th century, treated Rome with great respect, but did not teach papal infallibility. Instead, he emphasized the role of ecumenical councils in resolving doctrinal disputes. He famously said, "Rome has spoken, the case is closed," but this was in reference to Rome affirming what councils had already concluded, not an assertion of unilateral papal authority. St. Vincent of Lerins in the 5th century argued that church doctrine must be tested by what was believed everywhere, always, and by all, not by one bishop's decree. This matters because if papal infallibility were a universally accepted doctrine in the early church, we would expect to see it clearly taught by the fathers. Instead, we find repeated examples of bishops and councils treating Rome with respect, but not as an infallible authority. The definition of papal infallibility in 1870 was a reactionary development. The First Vatican Council defined papal infallibility as dogma, but only after significant internal opposition from bishops who recognized that this doctrine was never part of the early church. Historically, the doctrine that was defined in a context where the papal states were losing political power and the Vatican sought to centralize authority. Many Catholic bishops opposed the definition of infallibility in Vatican I. Some left the council rather than vote for it. The Catholic historian Johann Joseph Ignaz von Dollinger was opposed to Vatican I's definition and wrote that papal infallibility had no historical basis in the first millennia. If papal infallibility were truly apostolic, why did it take 1,800 years to define? The Church does not invent dogmas, it confirms what has always been believed. The late formalization of papal infallibility suggests it's a theological innovation rather than an original doctrine. The early Church did not hold to Vatican I's understanding of what papal infallibility is. Ecumenical councils never affirmed such a thing. Popes were condemned for heresy, which would not be possible if they were infallible. Church fathers restricted Rome but did not teach infallibility. The definition of papal infallibility in 1870 was a late and controversial development. If infallibility was not part of the first 1,000 years of Christianity, then one can reject it without rejecting the apostolic faith. Orthodox Christianity offers continuity with the early church without requiring belief in doctrines that were later innovations. So that's all my first point. Next 4 points will not be quite so lengthy. In fact, they're fairly short. But the role of ecumenical councils versus papal supremacy. The Orthodox Church argues that the early church was governed by councils or synods, not by a single bishop with supreme authority over the entire church. The first 7 ecumenical councils shaped Christian doctrine, and none of them recognized the Bishop of Rome as an infallible figure with unilateral authority. Orthodox Christians challenge Catholics to find an ecumenical council before the Great Schism that explicitly supports the idea of papal infallibility as defined in 1870 at the First Vatican Council. So I realize many Catholics and many Catholic historians and particular fake historian YouTubers will look back through history and find any reference they can to the Pope or anything that acknowledges the Pope as having authority, but they cannot find anything that explicitly points to anything remotely like Vatican I and the authority or infallibility spelled out in Vatican I existing within the first millennia. Point number 3, papal infallibility is a novelty. The idea of papal infallibility is one of the strongest points of contention between Orthodox Christians and Catholics. Orthodox object this, and our reasoning for objecting it includes no evidence in the early church, which I've to some degree already discussed most of these, historical contradictions, Vatican I is a late innovation, I've gone ad nauseum on that, but Orthodox Christians argue that no ecumenical council or early church father affirmed papal infallibility as a binding doctrine. While early Christian writers rejected the Bishop of Rome, they did not see him as having unilateral authority over doctrine. For instance, St. Cyprian of Carthage, and I think I've already quoted this, so I won't go too far into it again, but he affirmed the importance of Rome, but rejected the idea that the Pope had absolute authority over other bishops. Or really, if you follow out what Pope Pius IX said, he doesn't even really acknowledge other bishops at all. So that is probably the single most largest deviation that we would point to. So there are historical contradictions. I've already pointed to Popes Honorius, Liberius, and Vigilius, and then Vatican I as a late innovation. Point number 4 is what Orthodox Christians would say is the true model. This is the model of primacy amongst bishops without supremacy. The Orthodox Church acknowledges that the Bishop of Rome had a primacy of honor in the early church, meaning that he was respected as first among equals among bishops. However, this primacy did not mean that he had unilateral authority over the church or the power to define dogma infallibly. The Orthodox position is that authority in the church should be exercised collegially through councils rather than centralized in one figure. So Catholic counterarguments and Orthodox responses to these counterarguments. Catholics often cite verses like Matthew 16:18 through 19, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it," as evidence for papal authority. But Orthodox Christians will point to the fact that Peter's role was unique, but not supreme. So one example is that other apostles also received the power to bind and loose, such as in Matthew 18:18, which says, "Assuredly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." So this was not spoken to Peter, but rather to all of the apostles. If your doctrine in your church is founded upon the idea that Peter is uniquely the only apostle having such authority, then you're going to have a real difficult time with some of these passages, which Catholics sometimes actually do. Church fathers did not interpret this as papal supremacy. Many saw the rock as Peter's confession of faith, not his person. Among these, least of all, is St. Augustine. So St. Augustine, initially, when he wrote his commentaries on Matthew, I think he actually did point to this being Peter, but before the end of his life, he actually wrote St. Augustine's retractions, and he goes back and clarifies that this was false teaching, this was wrong, and he clarifies that it is Peter's statement of faith that is the rock, and not Peter himself as his person. Peter himself was subject to correction, which you can see in examples like Galatians 2:11, where Paul rebukes him, showing that even an apostle was not infallible. In Galatians 2:11, it says, "Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed." So Peter himself was not infallible. Anyway, I'll move on from that. To conclude this, these things matter for Catholic converts to Orthodoxy as well as Protestants. For many Catholics who are disillusioned with modern changes in Catholicism but remain attracted to the idea of papal authority, the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox argument that the Pope was never intended to be infallible is a key argument. If papal infallibility is not an original teaching of the Church, then it means that one can leave the Roman Catholic Church and still remain in true apostolic faith, as in the Orthodox Church, without rejecting the historical Church. So this same ideas, these same things that would be appealing, I believe, to Catholics about the Orthodox Church are also appealing to Protestants. Protestants can look at the papal claims and say there's a problem here. There is a theological argument, but they still crave that historical connection to the Apostolic Church. They still crave the connection to the Church, which was truly founded upon the rock, and that the gates have never prevailed against. And when they discover the Orthodox Church, they find that there is finally a church that they can join, that they can become a part of, that doesn't come with the baggage, that doesn't come with the false teachings. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people in the Orthodox Church that can be difficult. I am one of them. So if you know me, I can be probably difficult for some people to get along with at times. Just because the church is true does not mean that it's easy. So, bear that in mind. We do not have any teaching saying that bishops are infallible. Therefore, there are Orthodox bishops who will teach things that must be condemned, and we have processes for condemning those things. But that very nature that we would argue that our bishops are not infallible is exactly why you will actually see bishops who we would say have taught false teachings, and they are dealt with. But Catholics will point to the Orthodox Church and say, oh, they have problems too. But it's not the same, because we don't declare our bishops to be infallible. So if they teach something wrong, there's a way for other bishops to condemn that and for the church to continue without having the gates of hell prevailed against it. When you declare your own bishop to be perfect and infallible and the one true only bishop over all other bishops, and then there are glaring errors where he has done something wrong or he has taught falsely, that's not the same at all. So I think Protestants, seeing the Orthodox Church in this light and discovering these things, they are attracted to it because of that. And then Catholics, likewise, when they start to acknowledge some of these errors or they start to see problems within their own church, it's a way for them to continue in the Catholic faith, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, without the theological errors. So that's it for the first video in this series. I hope you enjoyed it. You guys take it easy, and I'll talk to you in a video coming soon.